Faye Langston, 26 years old and 14 months a widow, had baked 4 loaves of honey wheat bread before sunup and carried them 3 blocks to Drummond's general store in a cloth-lined basket. Because the only currency she had left that anyone in Colby, Kansas, was likely to accept without argument was the work of her own 2 hands. Cal walked beside her, 9 years old, and quiet in the particular way that children grow quiet when they have understood more than they should have to. He held 2 of her fingers rather than her whole hand. He'd gotten too old, sometime in the past year, to simply take her palm without deliberating about it, and this compromise was what they'd arrived at. 2 fingers, which Faye had decided she was going to call enough. The bread smelled good. The morning was cold enough she could see her breath. Herschel Drummond looked at the basket, looked at her, and said what she'd already known he would say before she'd come through the door. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Langston. Cash only from here on. I can't carry any more credit against goods." She thanked him, because that was the kind of woman she was, and because there was nothing useful in being otherwise, and she picked up the basket and turned toward the door. Cal stopped walking. He wasn't looking at the door. He was looking at the glass display case along the far wall, a pan of cornbread, golden brown, and still pulling heat off its surface, a jar of preserves with the wax seal unbroken, and 2 soft rolls that someone had braided the tops of with more care than the job strictly required. Faye had spent 8 months running out of new ways to explain hunger to a 9-year-old. She'd tried patience and practicality, and the careful, exhausting creativity of a woman who had become an expert at making a small amount of food feel like more than it was. But standing in Drummond's store watching her son look at a pan of cornbread with the absolute, stripped-down stillness of a child who has learned that wanting something and asking for it are no longer the same question. That was something she hadn't found language for yet. The man at the feed counter had been waiting on a roll of fencing wire and had not been paying the Langstons any attention at all. He was 48 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had spent considerable time outdoors and showed it honestly. His name was Orson Buell, and he worked cattle 7 miles south of Colby on a modest operation hen he had built over 20 years from a hired hand's wages. And he noticed Cal the way a man notices something that reminds him of a thing he has never quite been able to stop carrying. He left his order at the counter and crossed the store before he had made a conscious decision to. "Ma'am," he said, turning his hat over in his hands, "I was fixing to get breakfast over at Ida's before the morning got too far along. I'd be glad of the company if you and your boy would join me. I generally order more than I get through, and it's a slow morning." Faye Langston was 26 years old and had spent 14 months learning which offers to refuse and which ones were exactly what they appeared to be. She looked at this man for a long enough moment to be certain. What she saw was not condescension. What she saw was not pity. "That's kind," she said carefully, "but we're not in the habit of." "I don't make the offer as a habit," Orson said. "That's why I'm making it now." Cal, without consulting anyone, had turned away from the display case and was looking up at the stranger with the frank, unguarded assessment of a 9-year-old who has not yet learned to dress his instincts in diplomatic clothing. "Mama says Ida's smells like good coffee when we walk past," Cal said. "It does," Orson agreed. "We've never been inside." "Well," said Orson Buell, "that's a thing worth correcting." Faye looked at her son. She picked up her basket. Martin Langston had died in July of 1888 when a section of new track on the Colby rail yard shifted under a work crew during the worst heat the county had recorded in 11 years. He had been 31 years old and had taken the railroad wage because it was the most reliable work in western Kansas, and because Faye's bread oven, a cast iron commercial model she'd ordered from an Eastern catalog with money her aunt had left her, was being paid down on a loan from Colby savings. And reliable was what a young family building something from nothing needed above everything else. The loan had been taken in Martin's name and secured against the oven itself, not the house, which they rented from an elderly woman on Elm Street and had no claim to. Just the oven, the one thing Faye knew how to use well enough to make a real living from, bolted to the floor of her kitchen, representing the only trade she knew thoroughly. Jasper Pickett, senior officer at Colby Savings, had been patient through the summer. The kind of patience that costs a man nothing while the interest continues to accrue regardless. By September, his patience had begun arriving in the form of letters. He had given Faye until the 1st of November to bring the account current, or the bank would take the oven as settlement. Without the oven, there was no bread. Without the bread, there was no income. The arithmetic finished itself every time she sat down to do it and arrived at the same answer. She had spent 14 months doing every kind of work Colby would give a 26-year-old widow with a young son. Bread sold door to door and through Drummond's when he'd take it, mending, hotel laundry on the weeks when bread money ran short. She had stopped eating full dinners herself sometime in March on the evenings when Cal's portion needed to stretch, and had gotten so practiced at telling him she'd already eaten while working that it had long since stopped feeling like dishonesty and started feeling like arithmetic. The kind that cost her something and saved him something, which seemed, all things considered, like a reasonable exchange. Orson Buell had grown up in Dodge City, the older of two boys raised by a woman named Lillian after their father left the family when Orson was 11 years old. He was 48 now, and the details of those years had softened at the edges the way photographs do with handling, but certain things had stayed sharp. The particular quiet of a house where the question of what was for dinner had already been answered in the negative. The specific sound of his mother in the kitchen before 4 in the morning, trying to make something from ingredients that didn't add up to a meal. The particular shame of a growing boy's hunger in a schoolroom where other children's lunches arrived, wrapped in more than hope. He remembered also the handful of neighbors who had noticed and done something about it without making an occasion of the doing. The woman 2 doors down who had appeared one November evening with a covered dish and set it on the porch without knocking. The feed merchant who had let his mother settle an account in labor that winter, the kind of arrangement offered without requiring her to explain herself first. Small things. Things that had never once felt like pity because the people doing them had never once needed them to feel that way. He'd taken his first hired hand wages at 17 and saved with the discipline of a man who understands in his body what it means to have nothing. By 25, he had enough to lease his first 20 head of cattle. By 38, the ranch was his in full. By 48, there was something left over besides, and he was careful about how he used it, because he had been on the other side of that line long enough that he understood precisely what certain kinds of help could cost a person in ways the helper never saw. He had never, not once in 37 years of having the means to do otherwise, sat comfortably in front of a full plate while a child watched him eat it in silence. That was a promise he had made to himself somewhere in those Dodge City winters, and he had kept it without announcement or ceremony every day since. The decision to cross Drummond's store that September morning had arrived in his feet before it had finished forming in his mind. At Ida's diner, with its blue gingham curtains and its smell of bacon fat and fresh biscuits and coffee, 9-year-old Cal ate with the focused, unhurried concentration of a boy who has learned not to take any meal for granted. He answered Orson's questions about school, about the creek north of the rail yard, about whether there were any decent catfish spots within walking distance, with the level, careful honesty of a child who has discovered that some adults are actually interested in the answers. Orson listened in a way that suggested he had time, which was a thing Faye had not seen a man do in a long while without wanting something for it afterward. She watched her son's shoulders drop, slowly and then all at once, from somewhere around his ears to where they were supposed to be. She had not understood, until that exact moment in a diner she'd never been inside before, how badly she had needed someone else to notice. "You bake good bread," Orson said, when Cal had occupied himself with a second biscuit, and the two adults had a moment between them that was quieter than most. "How would you know that?" Faye asked. "Drummond had some of yours 3 weeks back, honey wheat. He turned his coffee cup once. I bought the last of it, better than what he usually carries. He won't take it on credit anymore." "No," Orson said, "he won't." A pause. "That's not a judgment on you, that's the numbers." "The numbers are what they are," Faye said. "Not bitterness, precision." "Then let's work on the numbers," Orson said, in the same tone he might have used to suggest checking a fence line that needed attention. Faye looked at him across the table. Her son was on his third biscuit, and the particular pinch around his eyes that had been there since July of the year before had gone somewhere else entirely, and she thought, "This is a man who has been hungry himself. You can tell. The ones who have been hungry themselves always know exactly what not to say. There are stories, I have found, that travel further than the people who tell them expect. If this one has found you tonight, wherever you're sitting, whatever part of this good wide country or this world you've made your home, I am glad you're here. Prairie Hearts reaches places I never anticipated when I started putting these stories together, and knowing where you're listening from means more than I can say properly. Drop a comment and tell me. Your city, your state, your country. If this story is keeping you company tonight, a like helps this channel more than you might think. I read every one. Now, the letter from Colby Savings had been sitting on Faye's kitchen table for 2 days, and what was about to happen at her front door was coming considerably sooner than any deadline Jasper Pickett had originally set. Over the following 3 weeks, Orson Buell found reasons to order bread from Faye Langston. Not just bread, he mentioned to his neighbor Mrs. Connolly that he'd come across an excellent baker in town, and to the wife of his hired man that he'd heard the Langston woman did fair mending as well, and to the ladies of the Colby Methodist Church social. When the subject arose naturally, that he'd had occasion to try some of the finest honey wheat bread in western Kansas, and that the woman who baked it was looking to build her trade if anyone was of a mind. He paid promptly. Always cash, always, the morning of delivery, always without comment on whether the particular quantity he'd requested was strictly what a single man on a cattle ranch could reasonably go through. Faye noticed the pattern by the second week. She said nothing about it. She understood it for what it was, careful, practical kindness wearing the costume of commerce, and she was honest enough with herself to know that accepting it was the right thing to do because the money was what Cal needed, and refusing it to protect a pride that wasn't serving her son seemed like the wrong kind of stubbornness. Cal had begun asking, on the mornings she drove the bread wagon out toward Buell's place, whether he could come along. Orson showed him how to test a fence post for rot by pressing on it sideways, and how to read the weather off the color of the western sky at midday, and which of the 4 horses on the ranch would tolerate a 9-year-old's inexpert handling without theatrical complaints. Cal, who was 9 years old and had been carrying something too heavy for 9 years old since the previous July, absorbed all of it with the serious, complete attention of a boy who has been handed something real and understands it as such. "He laughs out there," Faye told Orson one afternoon, watching Cal attempt to convince the more patient of the mares to accept a handful of grass from his palm. "He hasn't laughed like that since his father." "Kids know a good place when they find one," Orson said. It's one of the few things they're still better at than grown people. What do grown people do instead? He was quiet a moment. Spend too much time wondering whether they deserve it, he said. The second letter from Colby Savings arrived on a Thursday. Jasper Pickett, 57 years old and 22 years behind a bank officer's desk, had written it himself in the careful, regretful language of a man who has decided that written regret costs him nothing. The bank had suffered several significant loan defaults in the fall season. The crop failures had been hard on the county's farmers, and the resulting shortfalls had left the institution needing to accelerate collection on outstanding secured accounts. The oven that represented the collateral on the Langston loan would need to be surrendered 3 weeks ahead of the original deadline. A representative would call at the end of the following week. Without the oven, there was no bread. The arithmetic finished itself before Faye had set the letter down. Cal came home from school and found her at the kitchen table with it. He didn't ask what was wrong. He sat down across from her and did his schoolwork in the quiet way he had developed this past year of keeping her company without requiring her to perform fine when she wasn't. He said at dinner that he wasn't very hungry, which was the same small dishonest kindness she had been offering him for months, and hearing it arrive in her 9-year-old son's voice undid something in her chest she had been holding carefully in place for a long time. She told Orson the following morning. She hadn't planned to. The words came on the drive out, and by the time she'd pulled up to the ranch gate she had already decided she was not going to pretend to a man who had been paying close attention for 3 weeks that everything was under control when it was not. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. "I'd like to go speak to Pickett," he said when she'd finished. "No," said Faye Langston before he'd finished the sentence. "Faye?" No. She was not unkind about it. She was completely clear. "That debt is mine. It has my name attached to it and my oven at the end of it, and I have kept everything standing for 14 months on work I did with my own hands. I will not have the resolution handed off to someone else to manage on my behalf because he has a faster path to Pickett's office than I do." Orson said nothing. "My pride," she continued, and her voice came close to breaking on the word, and then didn't quite, "is the last thing I have that nobody has managed to take yet. I have gone without meals so my son would not have to. I have shown up to every single day of the past 14 months and done the work and kept the line. I will not let that be erased by someone solving it for me in the last quarter mile because it is faster than watching me do it myself." She stopped. "You do not know what it costs to hold on to something like that when it is the only thing left." Orson was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, the certainty had gone out of his voice and left something more honest in its place. "You're right," he said. She looked at him. "I got scared of the deadline and I moved before I listened," he said. "That was mine to own, not yours to accommodate. I'm sorry for it." He set his hat down on the fence rail. "Let me ask you something instead. What would the right version of this look like? If the decision stayed yours, the work stayed yours, and it still came out the other side of next week with that oven in your kitchen." Faye sat with that. "Signed orders," she said slowly. "Enough guaranteed income in writing that Pickett has to look at numbers instead of a widow with a debt. He is a banker. Bankers think in secured returns. I know 6 ranch wives who have mentioned needing a reliable bread supplier since the Tiersons moved their operation east last spring." Orson said it the way he said most things, as information without performance attached to it. "If you're willing to go ask them yourself, I'll drive you. Your name on every contract. Your terms, your prices, your handshake." She looked at him for a long moment. "I ask," she said. "You ask," he said. "I drive." They spent 4 days covering 12 miles of Kansas dirt road in every direction from Colby. Faye knocked on every door herself, carrying samples, stating her prices without apology or qualification, leaving with either a signed commitment or a polite refusal she didn't hold against anyone. She came away with 6 contracts, standing orders for bread and baked goods through the following December, each one paid in advance on delivery, each one bearing her signature alongside theirs. She addressed the envelope to Colby Savings herself. But Jasper Pickett did not wait for a letter. On a gray Wednesday morning, he arrived at Faye's front door himself, with the county sheriff 2 steps behind him holding a folded legal notice, and half the neighborhood already gathered at a careful distance, the way neighbors do when bad news has traveled faster than the people carrying it. Cal was standing just behind his mother in the doorway, his school bag still over one shoulder from the morning, gripping the door frame with one hand because he had understood the moment he came around the corner and saw the men on the porch exactly what was happening. "Mrs. Langston," Pickett said, with the particular gentleness of a man who has decided that gentleness is something he can afford to express freely, "I'm sorry for the manner of this. The bank's position requires—" Before you finish that sentence, Orson Buell came up the front walk at a pace that made no pretense of being casual, a leather portfolio held under one arm. He had stopped at the ranch to collect it that morning, which was why he'd arrived after Pickett rather than before. And he came to stand beside Faye in the doorway. Not in front of her, not ahead of her, but beside her, at her right shoulder, which was exactly the position he had agreed upon with himself sometime over the past 4 days of dirt roads and signed contracts. "Mr. Pickett," he said, and held out the portfolio. "Before you send anyone into this woman's kitchen, I'd ask you to look at what's in here." Pickett took it, because Orson did not give him a graceful way to refuse. He opened it in the thin October light, with the sheriff standing to one side, looking as though he would strongly prefer to be somewhere other than exactly where he was, and the street quiet around all of them. He read. He turned pages. He stopped at the 3rd contract and read it again. "These are all signed," he said. "Everyone," Faye said. 6 contracts, standing orders through next December, paid on delivery. That is more reliable income than half the accounts your bank is currently carrying on its own books, Mr. Pickett, and I believe you know it." Pickett studied the last page. The street waited. Cal, 9 years old and entirely still in the doorway, watched every adult in the scene with the careful, complete attention of a child who intends to remember what he is witnessing. "My wife wanted to open a bakery," Pickett said. He said it quietly, as though the thought had arrived without his planning for it. 30 years I sat behind that desk telling her the timing wasn't right, that the numbers didn't support it yet, that there was always a better season to consider it. She passed 4 winters ago. He looked down at the contracts in his hands. She never did get to when the timing was right. The sheriff shifted his weight and looked at the pale sky. Pickett folded the portfolio slowly. The whole street was still. "I'll have restructured terms prepared by Monday, Mrs. Langston. 18 months, same rate, secured against the income in this folder rather than against your equipment." He looked at Cal, still standing in the doorway, still watching. "Your mother is a remarkable woman, son." Cal considered Jasper Pickett with the measured directness of a 9-year-old who has been paying close attention to everything all morning. "She was remarkable before you got here," Cal said. Pickett nearly smiled. He handed the portfolio back to Faye, touched his hat brim, and left with the sheriff. The small crowd that had gathered began slowly to disperse. Several of the women who had signed those contracts, stopping to press Faye's hand on the way past, without making an occasion of it, which she found to be its own particular kindness. She stood in her own doorway for a long moment after the street had emptied. Cal, finally released from the grip he'd had on the doorframe all morning, bolted after a neighbor's dog with the sudden, complete energy of a 9-year-old who has been holding very still for a very long time. Orson was still standing on the front walk. "You should have told me Pickett was coming this morning," Faye said. "I didn't know," he said. "I only knew I had the folder and I wasn't going to be late." She looked at him in the pale October light. He was standing there with his hat in his hands, looking exactly like what he was. A man who had driven 4 days of Kansas back roads beside her without once suggesting he knew better than she did what her own work was worth, and who had arrived this morning not to lead the way, but to hand her the thing she had already built. "You could have walked in there and talked Pickett around yourself," she said. "Probably faster." "Probably," Orson agreed. "But then it would have been my deal, and that seemed like it would cost you something worth considerably more than the time it might have saved." Faye Langston stood in her own doorway on a morning when nobody was coming to take anything from her for the first time in 14 months, and looked at a 48-year-old man who had learned, in the space of one hard conversation, exactly how to help without taking over. "I think," she said, "you've been paying attention." "I've been trying to," said Orson Buell. They married the following March, once the debt was restructured and the first winter under the new arrangement had passed without incident, and the contracts had held exactly as promised. The ceremony was small, at the Colby Methodist Church, though it was attended by considerably more of the county than either of them had strictly planned for, including Jasper Pickett, who sat a third, told anyone who asked that he had simply made a sound financial decision in restructuring that account, though he remained at the reception longer than a sound financial decision typically detains a man, and was seen more than once looking considerably more moved than the numbers alone could account for. Faye opened her bakery that spring in a narrow storefront 2 doors down from Drummond's general store, with a clean-painted sign above the door, "Langston's." She kept the name because it was hers, and because it was Cal's, and because it was the name under which she had knocked on 6 doors in 4 days, and asked for what she needed without apology, and because she intended for it to mean something specific in this town going forward. By the 2nd year, she had hired a second baker, a widow from east of the county who needed steady work and received it, at fair wages, without ceremony, or the particular kind of compassion that makes the person receiving it feel like a problem that has been charitably managed rather than a capable woman who has been properly paid. Cal grew up largely at Buell's ranch, learning fence work and cattle management from a man who had never once made the teaching feel like anything other than a plain, quiet pleasure. He called Orson by his first name until he was 12, and then one afternoon, without announcement or discussion, he stopped. Orson received the change with the same unhurried, uncomplicated patience he brought to most things in his life. Faye kept framed on the wall, behind her bakery counter, the first signed order from those 4 days of driving. Ada Drummond's, for 2 loaves per week, which Ada had signed at her own kitchen table with 3 children looking on, and which had been the first name on the first page of that leather portfolio. She kept it not because the amount had been large, though the money had mattered. She kept it because it was the first time the full value of what she produced had been written down by someone else, in ink, on paper, in a form that a banker was required to take seriously. Not charity, not sympathy dressed up in the language of commerce. Just work, recognized plainly and paid for what it actually was. There is a thing I have turned over many times in the years I have spent with stories like this one. Orson Buell grew up as the boy nobody helped fast enough, and he spent 37 years making certain he was never that person for anyone else. But noticing is not the same as knowing how. The fact that he got it wrong the first time and listened when Faye told him so, that he apologized without trying to explain himself out of being wrong, and then changed, that is not a small thing in a man. Most people are given the chance to learn that lesson. Most people do not learn it. What saved Faye Langston was not a kind man with a leather portfolio, and it was not 6 signed contracts, and it was not even the particular decency of a banker who carried his own unfinished grief quietly enough that it could still surprise him in the middle of a business transaction. What saved her was 2 things arriving in the same place at the same time. A 26-year-old woman who knew what her work was worth and would not pretend otherwise, regardless of how badly pretending might have smoothed things over. And a 48-year-old man willing to learn, in the space of one honest argument, the difference between solving a problem for someone and standing beside them while they solve it themselves. Cal Langston grew up knowing both things at once because he watched both of them live it every single day. That you can accept help without surrendering the work. That dignity and kindness are not opposites unless someone makes them so. He learned it from his mother, who had demonstrated it every day of his 9 years. And he learned it from the man who had sat across from him at Ida's diner one September morning and asked him, with straightforward, genuine interest, whether the creek behind the rail yard was worth fishing. That is not a small thing to give a child. Most people never think to offer it. Thank you, truly, for spending this evening with Faye, Cal, and Orson. Stories like this one travel further than I ever expect, and wherever tonight finds you, whatever corner of this good country or this wide world, I am grateful you're here. May God bless you and the people you love. And until we meet again here on the prairie, friend, keep the hearth burning.